A lot of what I did at the Federalist for a long time and what I do now is study culture and think about culture and write about culture. And so one thing I think might be helpful to sort of talk about here is take a step back and ask ourselves why these legal conversations are so fraught, why they're so thorny, what's going on. And let's just start with the obvious. Modern pornography is not natural. It's not natural. That doesn't make it categorically bad, of course. Like if you've ever had peanut butter that's processed and natural peanut butter that you get out of like the tap at Whole Foods, you know that is not a categorical necessity, but it does present new challenges for the human race, really the human race, as we seek to mediate sexual impulses, sexual behaviors, and the civilization that rests on them. It's the building block of life, so it's obviously very important. So a major problem of living in hyper-novel times is pausing to recognize what exactly is changing with each new layer of technology and why those changes are good, why they're bad, why sometimes it's a mix of the two. Before photography, sexual gratification did not come from real moments in strangers' lives. It was between humans in an immediate physical context, or it was imaginary based on drawings or whatever else. Photography changed that. Sex could actually be preserved and sold in magazines and on VHS tapes. The internet removed even more friction from the process of sexual gratification, putting cameras and porn stores in our pockets every second of every day. And actually, I think the example of a man walking up to a bodega counter with a pornography magazine is a really interesting one. And comparing that to what it's like to shop for porn, consume porn on the internet. You had to have a physical interaction with a cashier in that situation. And that may sound silly, but that's a very different experience than when people are accessing pornography now. And I think that's a point that to younger people, they're sort of the fish. You don't know if you're wet, right, if you're a fish. But in this case, just thinking back to how it was for the vast majority of human existence, let alone just the last 100 years of photography, that is a very, very, very different experience than what the norm is for so many young people today. So what's bought and sold is almost entirely those interactions, the physical interactions themselves, these intimate interactions between people who will never meet. They have extremely limited social and legal obligations to one another. So why does that matter? Well, in person, a woman could physically say no, she can express discomfort, she can run away, but there's no way for any pornography consumer to know whether any video they're watching was made consensually. Or as Louise Perry has pointed out, there's no way for anybody to know whether the subject still consents to the publication of that piece of pornography, video, photography, whatever it is. There's no way that any person consuming it knows the real answer to that question. Zoom out from an OnlyFans webcam frame, and there's an abusive boyfriend watching over someone. You don't know. You're not there physically. You don't know them. You have no social obligation to them. For the most part, they're not within your social network. Internet pornography also renders us mass consumers of prostitution. Our sexual culture is now defined as transactional, having been molded in exchanges of data and money and clicks. Just a few decades ago, most people had never been involved in exchanging goods for access to another person's sexual intimacy. Exchanging goods. Maybe that's your click, maybe that's your eyeball on the ad on the side of the screen, but it is a transaction. It is a transaction. Why do we think about the objectification of women? Why is that a pejorative? It really refers to stripping someone of their humanity. Surely there is nothing that strips a person of their humanity quite like recording sex acts and blasting them to strangers in every corner of the globe for every year to come. Virtually, of course, that person is a product. They're not a human that you need to treat gently with a scent, a feel, and a family that you know. Of course, here, all of this takes for granted what we agree on, that healthy sex is consensual sex between husbands and wives. And if we, as we all here do, for the most part, believe sex outside those narrow confines is wrong and those confines are crucial norms for society, then it's obvious to us that buying and selling sex outside those confines is wrong and dangerous. So of course it's bad for our mental health, it's bad for family formation, for childhood development, for happy marriages, for our souls. But even secular observers are beginning to concede there's really a mountain of data in that direction. Let's look at some of this. There's conflicting research, and these guys can tell you about that, but there's some things that are pretty incontrovertible and obvious at this point. Repeatedly, studies have found that the average age kids are exposed to pornography is 12. 12 years old. One study found more than half of kids said they saw adult content accidentally. They didn't opt into it, and their children. They saw it accidentally after clicking on links they thought dealt with other matters. In that study, some 41% of kids said that their exposure to pornography came during the school day. The same study found 84% of the pornographic images kids saw depict acts of violence, rape, and choking someone in pain. 84%. I'm sure, again, there will be some quibbling about the numbers, how people are defining that, but we all know most young people don't make it out of high school. Most young people don't make it out of high school without seeing a stranger engaged in violent sex acts at least once. And for many, it's much, much, much more often than that. They don't go through a day without seeing a stranger engaged in violent sex acts at least once. That is not normal. That is trauma. That is mass trauma. If there's any good news, I guess it's that they're all going through this together. Younger people are all going through this together and starting to look around at each other and realize what's happened. But the toothpaste just cannot go back into the tube on this. Most members of today's generation of children will never exist without having witnessed many strangers having sex with each other, and in many cases been involved in a transaction. These are people outside their communities, on the other side of the world, people whose lives they dip into for 5 minutes of the most intimate behavior that we do as human beings. So for each one of these millions and millions of people, overcoming this to function healthily as adults will necessarily involve Herculean efforts, far beyond what our culture is currently encouraging. So the Institute for Family Studies found, based on survey data, that men in their 30s and 40s report the most frequent use of pornography. It's not just kids. Men in their 30s and 40s, majority, 57% of men aged 30 to 49 report having watched pornography in the last month, and 42% said they'd watched it in the past week. For young men, that's about 44. These are self-reported, by the way. And for seniors in the last month, over the last month, it was 26%. So nearly 60% of men in their 30s and 40s are watching porn every month. Husbands, fathers, and surely this is downstream of other social dysfunctions in the West today. But, take a libertarian argument. Is this even a problem? Is it harmless? Is it maybe good? Well, IFS also found that men who report having watched pornography recently in the past 24 hours report the highest rates of loneliness. 6 in 10 men who watch pornography in the last 24 hours say they felt lonely or isolated at least once in the past week. This is from an article that BYU published. A significant body of research correlates viewing pornography with lower emotional security. One study asked participants to self-report on their emotional health, and it found that those who had watched pornography in the last 24 hours reported higher rates of loneliness compared to those who had never watched pornography before. Other research has measured depression, anxiety, and stress among pornography users and non-users. One study performed with over 1,000 college age participants concluded that compulsive pornography use significantly contributed to all 3 of those mental health measures. Marriage, BYU's analysis also found 2018 study without pornography. In the study, a 20-year-old had a 6% chance of getting divorced or separated. With porn, that went up to 51%, a 51% chance. So by comparison, a 40-year-old had an increased risk that was about 6 to 12% higher when pornography was introduced. Either way, increasing the risk of divorce. There is all kinds of research, some of which has been shared here today. It's a growing body of evidence that even feminists, I agree, this is very fertile ground for the sort of Andrea Dworkin crossover event, the most unlikely crossover of all time. But in all seriousness, there is really fertile ground here. This is about to get even crazier with generative AI. We all know that it is obviously not healthy or moral on an individual or cultural level to have constant, unfettered access to recordings of random people from around the world having sex with each other, often violently. We do not need studies and scientific research to confirm that. I'm glad that it's confirming it, but we don't need it. This is obvious. We all know this. And AI might, theoretically, from the libertarian perspective, sort of solve this problem of real people being engaged in these sex acts and these transactions. But it also opens up another, a whole new suite of moral pitfalls, potentially, in that realm of limbic capitalism, as David Courtwright calls it. The possibilities for addiction are endless. This stuff commodifies the most basic human function, most healthily enjoyed with love, our most important human emotion. It discourages dating. It gives people an outlet to enjoy a passing artificial version of the most important human function. It numbs us with historically unprecedented levels of exposure to shocking and violent sexual imagery. And even if we grant someone the premise that porn can be healthily created and enjoyed in moderation, it is abundantly clear that is not what our system is set up for at the moment, and it's especially true when that comes to children. So to defend the status quo is to defend that. To ignore the issue is to defend that. To treat it as anything less than a cultural emergency is to defend that status quo. So just to wrap up, I was thinking back as I was thinking about this panel to another panel at NatCon, I think it was 2 years ago. A 26-year-old British man just that week was quoted in an article that was written by Susie Weiss, and I remember bringing it up on the panel at the time, but it couldn't possibly be more relevant. This is the quote. "Between social media and porn and podcasts and video games, you can live a low-quality simulation of what a fulfilling life would be. You can get social interaction from social media, the feeling of problem solving or being productive from video games, and sexual fulfillment from porn. I'm assuming these things don't give you as much as a normal life would, but it stops people from hitting rock bottom. The lowest possible quality of life you can have with the internet is still kind of tolerable. It's not absolutely awful. You can sort of exist in that, and there's nothing to give you a kick up the butt because it's not the worst thing. Not the worst thing might sound okay to a lot of people. The last thing I'll say is it is our duty to convince them that it is not okay." Thanks, everyone.